Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is a coaching special. Many of you out there, many of the listeners will know that I work with a coaching group, of which we have about 11 or 12, if I remember correctly, specific ultra running coaches. And while we work with our athletes on an individual basis, we also use our collective coaching group as a way to harness the knowledge of all of us together, because we are greater than the sum of our parts. And so what I wanted to do on the podcast today specifically is to peel the curtain back a little bit on what some of those conversations look like. So I invited on the podcast today one of the very first coaches that I hired for ultra running specifically, and that is Coach John Fitzgerald. And we had a really cool conversation about what is going on right now with athletes during this transition period from COVID, where races did not happen at all, to now the races are going to gradually, slowly come back online. We talked about that. In addition to that, we talked about this new phenomenon of personal projects and FKTs and how those can get woven into successful athlete training and successful athlete goals. John is one of the coaches that I work with on a daily basis that I have the most tremendous amount of respect for. His athletes absolutely love him, and you're going to see why in this podcast. So here we go. Let's get right into it. Here's my conversation with Coach John Fitzgerald. So like I said, I was saying earlier, I did Zangray this weekend, and here's where I have to show a little bit of humility here. I thought that it was 100K until like the week before the race, I think. Like I don't know what happened. Like I missed some critical piece of information from the race, because I signed up during the COVID year, which they were going to do their first edition of the 100K. So the course is traditionally 50 miles, and it's on this point-to-point course. They had to change it 1 year because of some Forest Service issue. And they were going to come back with a point-to-point 100K, which was going to be awesome. This was going to be like totally epic. I'd seen the entire course in pieces. And it's hard, it's rugged, it's everything that it's cracked up to be. It's a classic 50 miler, and extending it to 100K just makes it even better. It's not like they have to contrive the start or the finish. It's just more of really awesome trails. And I started checking my emails on it like the week before, like literally the week before the race. I'm like, wait a minute, this doesn't match up, because the information I was getting from one source was saying that it was 50 miles, and the information I was getting from another source said that it was 100K. And so finally I learned, I mean, it was like I'm really embarrassed to admit this, is like 6 or 7 days before the race, that it was actually in fact 50K, which was kind of a blessing for me because I was a little undertrained going into it. But I think that the whole thing just goes to demonstrate that it's weird, right? Like right now is like really weird, because not only are races literally up in the air, we had several, with San Diego was canceled, right? Just recently. Is that what it was? San Diego?
It wasn't postponed to.
Or was it postponed?
I'm not sure.
Anyway, races are being canceled or postponed, or in my case, it's switched from 50 miles to 100K and then back. And then I missed the and back part of it. And then in addition to that, for athletes that are traveling internationally, which, both of us, we coach athletes that, that are either coming to the United States to run,
Mm-hmm.
or live in the United States and are planning or doing things abroad. I've got athletes that are doing the Tour de Jante and some of the UTMB races and things like that. They're still in a little bit of limbo, because they don't know, not only will the race actually happen, but what are the quarantine restrictions going to be into the country that they're going to and back into the United States. And that might change from now until whenever the race is. And so there still is this cloud of ambiguity that's been going around the athletes, and we've been having to manage this at coaches. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. I personally had to live this because I made a mistake on my end, not realizing that the race had changed distances. But I got to use that. I got to use that as a little bit of intro just to say it's weird. So John, what have you been noticing with your athletes that are in this situation where they just don't know what the future holds?
Right. Yeah. There's been a lot coming up with that. I mean, the mixed emotions. I think nervousness for the athletes for the events are actually gonna actually go through. Canyons 100K just happened this past weekend, and I had a couple athletes racing that, and I know for a while that was still kind of a little bit up in the air, and there was
Right.
some last minute changes to the course there at the 100K. The vert went up a little bit, so the athletes were, a little bit nervous about that and the cutoffs. So I think, yeah, the races that are actually going off, because it's been a while. I think one of the athletes going into canyons, it had been close to 2 years since the last time they had towed the line and raced. So, I think it's going to be kind of normal to feel nervous and anxious going into a race like that. I've had athletes travel all the way down to Argentina and get turned around there by customs there. And, that's going to ruffle some feathers and a little bit stressful and having to go home and quarantine back at home. So I've seen kind of a mixed bag of athletes that are nervous, anxious heading into the races, and then other athletes that are a little bit hesitant to book flights and kind of go through
Right.
with, traveling or across seas. So yeah, it's been quite a stir.
So let's put our coaching hat on a little bit, because I think that some of the some of the changes that we all just went through are going to continue to happen, right? In my case, I thought that I was going to run 100K and I ended up running 50 miles. But you're right, in canyons this weekend, I had athletes in canyons. They changed part of the course.
Right.
Things like that of varying magnitudes are absolutely going to continue to happen. And
Mm-hmm.
they're going to unfold in a variety of different ways. Some of them might be the day of the race, right? The week of the race. Some of them might be a month before the race or 2 months before the race. Does that materially change the training going into it? And we could just use the canyons as an example, right? There's no way you
Right.
could have changed the training by the time that they made that change, right? You're not going to change because they
Right.
like 2 3 days before the race, maybe a week before the race. But if you would have known about those small changes, would that materially change any of the preparation going into it?
Not really. I mean, as far
Exactly.
as a couple thousand feet of vertical change, I mean, it's still up, down, up, down. So I wouldn't necessarily have an athlete do, increase their vertical throughout the week because of that small change. So yeah, there's, a lot of it's just kind of slowing things down a little bit and realizing that it's in a way kind of splitting hairs, the big difference that it's going to make. I mean, 50 miles compared to 100K, they're both really hard. Um, you know, um, and I know you get the question a lot, Coop, about long runs and when's the longest run going to be, but it's not like you're going to really, increase the duration of your long run for 100K too much. So,
Exactly. So I brought up the easy example, which is canyons. No, I don't think you would change the training at all. I even think with the stupid mistake I made, I probably wouldn't have changed anything, right? I mean,
uh-huh.
I mean, maybe like 3 or 4% or something like that. Like when we look at the entirety of training, all the way from January to now, which is April 24th or whatever it was.
Right.
Maybe there's a little bit here, a little bit there, but the difference between what I thought I was running, which is Zane Gray 100K, and what I ended up running, which is Zane Gray 50, which is totally my fault. Just to reemphasize that, I still don't think the training would be that all that much different. And so my point with that for the athletes that are out there that are going to experience these changes is that yes, you're going to have to change your logistics, right?
Right.
If crew's not allowed, crew's not allowed. You're going to have to figure out how to do things with drop bags and maybe longer aid stations and things like that. That's absolutely true. Yes, you're going to have to deal with the course change. Turn right here, turn left there, and there are people
Right.
at canyons that had recon the course. That when they went on the new course, they were actually confused as to which direction to go. So
Hmm.
yeah, those things are actually going to be at issues. They're actually going to be issues. But in terms of the training, which is what most people get nervous about, right? Have I done enough?
Right.
That fundamentally doesn't change all that much.
Yeah, not really at all. I think, yeah, logistics, if an aid station is separated, is a longer distance apart, You're going to want to factor all that in, doing your homework on the course, making sure there's not any crazy changes to the start finish, things like this, like you said, turns. But no, as far as the training goes, I mean, I think it's just putting in the consistent work and, not really, hitting the panic button and feeling like you got to do more, which I think athletes tend to constantly feel like they're not doing enough and they got to kind of up the ante a little bit. So,
Well,
uh,
one of those things that fuels it is something that you've mentioned earlier. It's been a while, right? I mean, it's been sometimes
right,
2 years since athletes have towed the start line and maybe even longer. And there is a routine to getting into races, right? I mean, there's not just a routine with the training part of it, but as the race kind of gets near, you start drawing these parallels between the climbs that you're doing during training and the climbs that you're doing in the race, the nutrition that you're doing in training and the nutrition that you're doing in the race, aid
right,
stations in the races, trying to like kind of visualize or kind of experience them in training for in some aspects that doesn't exist or that hasn't existed for a while. And I think a lot of the nervousness that we mentioned earlier with athletes has to do with the fact that they haven't towed the start line. They've kind of
hmm
gotten out of that routine. So are you doing anything specific with your athletes that are kind of returning to racing after this some maybe 2 year layoff in order to kind of like prepare them for those elements?
yeah, a few things. I mean, in conversation with the athletes, just kind of letting them know that they're not the only ones feeling, this anxiousness or feeling nervous going into the race. I mean, just pinning on the thought of pinning on a number, right, seems so maybe intimidating or things like this. But they're not the only one, and it can be easy to maybe feel isolated, like, oh my God, but a lot of people aren't racing or haven't raced in a while, you know? And so I think that's helped a lot of athletes just kind of keep it a little bit more cool going in and almost kind of look at it as, again, depending on what the race is for the athlete, if it's been a big race, if it's something that's been more of like a training race or a stepping stone leading into a bigger race, is kind of looking at it more of like a dress rehearsal in a way, kind of have that mindset, which kind of keeps it a little bit more relaxed, kind of going through the motions, if you will. So that's kind of helped a lot of athletes kind of calm down a little bit. But then also with the sport of ultra running, I think you and I can both agree that the community aspect and getting people together. So I've talked to a lot of athletes about that, and they get really excited in a good way. So I think it's a matter about channeling that excitement with being back with the ultra running community and sharing stories after the race and things like that. So I always like to bring that part up about the race, and that gets athletes pretty pumped.
It
So
can almost be too overwhelming though, because we
I would
haven't seen
agree. Yeah.
everybody in such a long time. I was at Black Canyons earlier this year, just spectating and supporting some athletes out there, and and they still had a very COVID compliant type of aid station setup. That was absolutely the case. But even with that, even with everybody kind of spread out and it's a point to point course, which kind of like spreads the support and, people that are watching out as well, even with all of those elements at play, there still was an enhanced level of enthusiasm there. And it was the first time that I thought that, oh, wow, when athletes do go back to races, especially the really big ones, there's going to even be a bigger spotlight on this concept to not burn all your matches before the gun goes off, right?
Right, right. That's a good point you bring up. Yeah, just kind of, being around the energy before the race. I'm thinking I'm going to races like UTMB and Western States, that there's a lot of pre-race hype and energy. So yeah, just being mindful of that too and not kind of overdoing that.
Well,
Uh,
it's compounded by, especially in those big races, the
yeah,
fact that with almost all of the athletes, right? The athletes that are just normal that have had to go through some sort of lottery process, they've had to wait to get entry into it for sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and then wait after COVID to get back at. So there's this like huge amount of like pent up, energy that's even that's multiplied
yeah,
by the time you actually get to the start line. And I actually think with those bigger races, that's going to be like for people like you and I who are working with these athletes that are going to UTMB, going to Western States, going to these big races that we're going to have to like very consciously manage that with our athlete groups in terms of the energy expenditure in the days, just a couple of days leading into the race, and just making them aware of all the pitfalls of that.
Oh, 100%. I mean, we know that, yeah, when cortisol is raised, I mean, you're burning through glycogen and, and all of this, and just being on your feet moving around. So I would say could definitely make or break your day for sure. The other one too is athletes getting pulled off of wait lists too. That's been happening more and more. When, I think maybe it's over athletes coming over from overseas can't make the race. So I'm having athletes that are getting into Western states that they're like, oh, totally, this isn't going to happen. So now it goes like the race, they weren't going to get in, they get pulled off the wait list. And so there's that excitement in that situation as well, where athletes are kind of, yeah, they're in this big race that they didn't think they were going to get into.
Okay, so practically, right? Let's use that as an example, but I think that a lot of athletes can extrapolate this to I don't know what's going to happen 4 months from now. I think I'm going to be in this race. I think it's going to happen.
Mhm.
Or like in your case, I'm not in Western states. I am in Western states. Like, what are you doing with your athletes just kind of presently in April and May, like really acutely to get them ready for either something that is different, like a wrinkle that's gotten thrown in the schedule that they need to take advantage of, or this unknown element? Like, what are the practical pieces that athletes can kind of put in place, like right here, right now, for the next several weeks as all these races are either coming back online or changing or
Right.
whatever they're going to do?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it goes to, how can we leverage that event still to continue to put in the work now and be best prepared for that event? So, I mean, obviously the consistency doesn't go away. I think more than ever, just because a race is kind of a question mark, I think we can still use that as how can we be more capable with our training today? And, if it's an area of our training that an athlete needs to work on, then we start getting to work on that and improving that weakness, getting it closer to a strength. And so, I mean, I think it goes back to, do we want to just arrive at the race ready, or do we want to, see what's available to us today and make the most of our training now? If the race gets canceled for some reason, you're really fit. You're really fit. You put it.
That's not the worst thing in the world.
Well, I always thought it's just like, okay, Chuck's there. I know that's not fun, but you're in really good shape right now. And so what else can we where else can we steer the ship to? And so it's not like it all goes to the wayside and it's not worth it. So there's a lot of creativity being that I'm seeing with athletes too. I've had athletes pick up other sports too that they used to engage with back in the day. For instance, this is the race that was supposed to happen in the spring and it got pushed to the fall. And so there's been, a little bit more time to kind of experiment again, hone those weaknesses a little bit, get them up to strengths, and still, again, put in amazing work. So, yeah, I've seen only good things actually come from that. Although there is a bit of anxiety too with it. I'm not saying that that's not there, but as far as the training, let's train as if it's going to happen and still, see what we can do.
Yeah, I was a big believer in that, almost to, my own detriment last year, that the races are still going to
Yeah.
happen. You're still going to train. And the worst thing that happens is you're more fit at the end of the day. And I think what we'll start to see this year is the athletes that went through that process and that psychology, they're ready.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're not pushing the panic button because they did all the work last
Right.
year throughout COVID without any races and things like that. And they don't have to create these big monumental training ramp ups and take all of the risks and get hurt and things like that, because they never really kind of they never really kind of skipped a beat. It's the athletes that, for whatever reason, and we're not going to get into that on this podcast, but for whatever reason, because of the ambiguity, took a leg down in their training.
Mm.
Now that everything's ramping back up, they're having to make up for all that lost time and normally train. And that ends up being, in a lot of cases, just a little bit, it can be just overwhelming. That's where people make mistakes, right? Because they feel that they're behind and they double down on their workload, and that just kind
Right.
of that all kind of spirals out of control. Um, for the athletes that are in the former group, I want to get your take on this. For the athletes that are in the former group that have kind of like done their homework, like almost universally, maybe 85 or 90% of the athletes that I've been working with, they're in this phase where they're taking a volume leg up. They spent January, February, March doing a lot of intensity, lower types of volumes, a lot of intervals, kind of like laying the intensity foundation. It's winter. Nobody wants to go out and do 8-hour runs in the snow and things like that. And now that things are starting to clear up, the intensity gets doesn't get completely put to the side, but it starts to have less of an emphasis, and then the volume starts to really ramp up here. And I kind of like this for two reasons. Is one, creating this initial volume leg up puts less pressure once the real racing starts to get underway, and you're having to maximize volume. So if you can imagine the training arc, not only in April and May, but also July and August, there are two big volume ramp ups right now, and then the volume kind of stays level. And then during July and August, when a lot of people have big key races around, that's like the ultimate volume leg up. But it's really taking advantage of the intensity that they've laid down right now. I don't know if you have the same experience with the athletes that are kind of in your group, John, where they're all kind of going through similar cycles at a similar time frame or not.
Yeah, I'd say so. And again, going back to the athletes that are kind of more process driven, really into the flow and the day to day approach. Again, not saying that the goal, the race doesn't matter, but they're very much so into getting out the door the next day and putting in the work. Yeah, they're in a good spot now in the sense of they have a good foundation. They've done the high intensity work that for an ultra runner can be maybe a little bit more intimidating, maybe not the top of the list of things to do. And now that, they're sitting there with, being able to get into the more specific training with the leg up and not having this kind of pressure, feeling like they need to kind of cram for the exam kind of a thing,
Right.
which can never be a good thing, obviously from an injury kind of side of things too, feeling like you got to kind of put in the work in a condensed fashion. So, I'm also seeing just the athletes that are realizing the benefit with not having that interruption with more frequent racing, the taper, the race. I'm injured. I got to recover from the race. So they're seeing the value in just the consistent work and layering week after week of consistent training and what that can do to your fitness. And then, getting into the summer months where the snow in the high country melts out, people are excited to get up into the mountains, and that's when you want to be putting in the bigger days. So, I can definitely relate to that for sure with my athletes.
Okay, you brought up something, and I'm going to ping off of it.
Okay.
There's this notion out there that because 2020 contained no racing,
Mm-hmm.
and ultra runners are notoriously over racing, in quotation marks, they're over racing,
Uh-huh.
that 2021, because there was no racing last year, is going to be the year of PRs and course records, and everybody is going to smash all of their goals because they were forced out of this over racing cycle that is
Uh-huh.
very clichély tied to trail and ultra running. Are we going to see that? Are we actually? This is banter, total.
Yeah.
Total prognosticating on our parts. Are we going to see all of the course records get smashed, and all of the everybody's PRs get smashed, and look back at this and go, "Yep, we were really over racing before now, and now we've learned our lesson." Is that going to actually happen?
I don't agree on that entirely, but I do think that there'll be some athletes that have some pent up energy that they they might kind of let one loose on the day and surprise themselves. But I don't think we're going to see a complete 360 180 of results. But again, I think there are going to be athletes that maybe haven't seen their full potential because they maybe have over raced that, like, whoa, I can pick a couple races that I'm pretty excited about and just kind of really focus on those. And, if anything, I think it'll just be a good experiment for athletes to kind of maybe see the difference between racing maybe a little bit more and then racing less and how they feel. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
agree with you. I think we're going to see a mixed bag, or we'll see
yeah, mixed bag.
some athletes will benefit from the lack of racing, but I think that we'll see just as many. It'll be about 50-50
Right,
that because the racing wasn't there and because the racing serves as a training stimulus in a lot of
right,
cases, and
right,
they're missing that, that those athletes are going to be those athletes are going to perform worse than they normally would. This is an impossible comparison, but
right.
I remember way back when COVID started, this was like part of the banter that kind of went around, and I was personally, this is just my opinion. Once again, it's just
Yeah.
banter. I was like, wait, hold on. I don't think that we we were chronically, we as a community chronically over race as much as what has been portrayed. B, I
Yeah.
don't think that everybody does that to the same extent. But anyway,
Yeah.
it's certainly an interesting facet, because even with the initial races, and Canyons is a really good example of that. Some of the feedback that I've been getting, at least on the elite side, is that there is a little bit of rust that needs to get knocked off. And
Hmm.
some athletes are intentionally trying to knock that rust off with personal projects.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about this before in some of our coaching calls. Some of these personal projects are like, they're 500% better than races in terms of how cool they are and how
Yeah.
neat and how impactful they are, how impactful they have been with athletes. Do you see that as like an element that continues to go forward now that athletes have experienced these personal projects that they've been doing?
Yeah. 100%. I mean, I think the personal projects, the FKTs, I mean, they're only going to get more popular. I think it's kind of getting in a way back to the roots of kind of ultra running, kind of getting out, creating an adventure, having that creativity with it as well. Some athletes are hitting some of the more well-known trails, the PCT, the AT, things like this. The Arizona Trail just got a supported FKT on that. But I think it kind of scratches a little bit of that itch, of that competitive drive that all of us athletes have in one way or another. And so I think it's a healthy thing. I think they're definitely here to stay, and I think they could provide tremendous growth for the athlete too, whether they choose to do it supported and have their coach or their family come out and support them, or they do it solo and kind of have a little bit of like a vision quest kind of deal. There's definitely growth in that for sure. So
I totally agree with you, and I'm going to tack on to that. I still think that we're going to have demand outstrip supply in terms of the demand for racing and the supply that the community of race directors can actually put out there, especially here in North America.
uh,
And I think because of that inequality between too much demand and not enough supply that can actually catch up, we're still going to continue to see athletes take on these really cool things, because now there are more and more blueprints out there for them to actually look at. There are more and more people that have done the Grand Canyon rim to rim to rim to rim. The more people that have done the Arizona Trail. There are more people that have done the Pimi Loop,
right.
up in the Northeast. And so the information that's out there, not just for the elite athletes, but for everyday athletes as well, the amount of information that they can draw from, not only logistically but also from an inspirational standpoint, just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I agree with your sentiment that that's going to be here to stay. And it's going to be interesting for us as coaches to try to help athletes navigate these personal projects that go alongside their racing goals that they might have. Have you had that with your athletes that have had these kind of like two things that are running in parallel, like a traditional race,
Yeah.
also personal projects?
Oh yeah, and that to me, Coop, has been like the real fascinating part and fun to work with athletes on. I have an athlete doing the Bigfoot, or actually he's doing the Triple Crown of 200 milers, and you know, a couple races got swept underneath them, and so we're kind of sitting there. Well, what can we do? And a question I like to kind of pose to my athletes is like, well, what's available to you, right? Okay, you don't
Yeah.
have the race that you signed up for, but let's take a look around and what can we get into? And so he's out in Virginia. He has the Appalachian Trail in his backyard. So we've schemed up some fast packing and some pretty fun routes. He has a 110-mile route on the AT through the Shenandoah National Park. And so he's just, I mean, ecstatic. Like he doesn't even talk about the 200 milers. It's all about this adventure on the AT. And that's all, again, how specific can you get for a 200 miler? He's going to be out unsupported. He's going to have everything on his back, and he's going to be covering 110 miles with quite a bit of elevation gain. So he's like a kid in a candy store. He cannot wait to get out on the AT. And that's all leveraging that towards his bigger goals later in the year, the 200 miler. So it's just been really fun to hear the excitement with the athletes too, as we kind of talk through the details and just get ready for those adventures. So it's been really cool.
So I hone in on two components of these personal projects. The first one you just mentioned, access, right?
Right.
The second one you mentioned without even realizing it, and that's inspiration. It's the things that they look at and they can say, wow, that is really freaking cool. I've always wanted to do this, but I've never, there's always some excuse.
Right.
But as I mentioned earlier, the amount of information that is out there for athletes to draw upon is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then those barriers that they've put up, I've never had the time. I can't put it together. I can't, conceivably, wrap my head around it or whatever. Those barriers are going to seem less and less insurmountable because more people do it and because of the information out there. And so that inspiration piece of it, it's just easier for athletes to grasp onto. And if you have those two things, access and inspiration, that's a really powerful combination for these personal projects. So much so that it starts to like almost engross all of their thoughts, because it's like they're spending every waking hour like looking at maps and thinking about what food to take and things that they're going to experience along the way. It's cool.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And I mean, again, athletes can get really fixated on the event and they obsess over it. And again, that's not a bad thing. But I think when we have these other objectives, whether it's a workout or a training camp or a weekend that they get to get out into the mountains, like we can get really excited about the little steps along the way. I mean, talk about creating a sustainable, fun process and, with your training. I mean, it's just unbelievable that the athletes are just, just getting this, I don't know if it's a second wind, but just being able to get out and see more of their backyard too. I've had a lot of athletes that they didn't even know it was there. Right. Some of the stuff, whoa, like I didn't know that was in my backyard. That's really cool. So there's been a tremendous amount of growth from it and inspiration, like you said. And I mean, just the tools too, the mapping devices. Like I've been coaching a lot of athletes. I do a lot of off trail kind of fast packing stuff myself, but getting athletes to think outside the box and not necessarily just follow a known path, but to create their own. And so that at first that might've been a little scary for an athlete to think about. And now they're thinking about creating their own route that no one's done before. Right. So that's added kind of a different element, a different twist to it too, but that's been really fun to coach athletes on as well.
So our athletes are lucky, right? Not to toot our own horn too much, but they have a collaborative partner in this with coaches like you and I, right? Because we definitely, we've been very conscious about this within our coaching group throughout COVID, that we're going to have to help lead athletes more so than we were used to leading them, because before we kind of had it easy. And I think we're now recognizing this as the races come around, they either get drawn or they don't get drawn. And then that kind of sets the table. But what's happened since COVID is we've had to play a more active part in curating what that athletic experience is going to be. Is it a race? Is it a personal project and things like that? And that curation is not, nobody teaches you that in college or in coaching school or whatever. That's something that we've all had to adapt to as coaches. I want to break that down a little bit, because because the listeners out there, that there's going to be a lot of them out there that are self-coach, and that's totally fine. And they're just navigating this themselves. But I think that the lessons that we've kind of learned as coaches on how to curate that experience or curate these personal projects in conjunction with our athletes, because they always have to lead the way, right? I think that we can, all athletes can kind of learn from that, can kind of learn through that process. So what have you specifically done with your athletes in that vein to curate those personal projects?
Yeah. I think, it depends on what they originally were kind of coming to me for coaching for, whether it was training for an ultra, things like this. But I mean, just taking, for example, a lot of the athletes I coach at 80% or so are training for an ultra marathon. They like to be outside. They like to be in nature. Right. So we kind of start there, it's kind of like some of these events that might've gotten postponed or canceled, what type of landscape was that race? Was it a mountainous race? Was it, was there some aspect of the route that really caught your eye? Right. So I just kind of bring those concepts up with the athletes, and then I get them to think more about like, well, where else can we access that? And so, kind of gets the athletes thinking a little bit. And again, I don't like to just, give them, well, hey, check this route out. I eventually will get there if they can't find it, but I like to get them to kind of do their homework a little bit, And so for example, that's where the AT, the Shenandoah came about. I was just like, well, your 200 milers have quite a bit of climbing. They've got some technical footing. What do you have out your door? And so a week, maybe it was a couple of weeks go by, and my athlete brought up the Appalachian Trail section. So it's more of a process. It doesn't happen overnight. You kind of get the creative juices flowing. Again, the question of like, what do you have access to? What's available to you? Kind of has the athlete maybe scratching their head a little bit. The question of like, where are some areas that you've always wanted to go visit? What's there, right? And so they break out the maps. They start looking at different areas that they can go, visit and see what's available there. So it's more about just asking questions with the athletes and kind of sparking a little bit of that curiosity. I think curiosity really comes to the surface. And I think once an athlete gets curious, then there's more digging, there's more investigation. And then that's where you can get out and go discover, right? So it's been asking questions and just kind of guiding the athlete along the way. So
yeah, I think the athletes that are out there that are trying to figure out what this might mean for them, they would be well suited to take that curiosity question to heart. Like, what things are you naturally drawn to that come to mind first? Is it a feature? Is it a particular trail? Is it a type of environment, really hot, really cold, really rocky, whatever? And then use that as an initial thread to pull on. You're helping them. You're helping them get to that initial thread. But it's really interesting that you mentioned you just kind of provided the first 1 or 3%.
Yeah,
they kind of run with it, right?
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. And I could maybe easily kind of jump a little bit further along and say, check this place out. Check this place out. But I might just pull a few parks, state parks in their area, a section of a trail. So I kind of give them a little bit of some clues to kind of look into. And that process again, because I think the athletes learn a lot from going through the process, not just being like, oh yeah, let's just pick this one. Let's just pick this trail. So I think it's more about that process and going through it. That again, going back to, encouraging an athlete to pick an ultra because there's something really special about it, because they're freaking hard and you want to find a race. It's the same thing with these big objectives and I think if you go through the process, you're patient with it, you're going to really find that meaning and that value of why you're doing it.
I love that, because the process that you go through on these personal projects can actually be retrofitted back into the races, because all too often you've had athletes like this, and I've had athletes like this. Athletes get into races that they just don't want to do. They FOMO into them because everybody else is doing it, or they feel that they have to because it's close to them, or because whatever reason. And it ends up in a lot of cases being kind of a resentful process, because they didn't like what they were training for in the first place. This, where you have unlimited choices to choose from, right? You can go anywhere and do these things. It kind of grounds them into, hey, these are the things that I'm really interested in that are really cool. Let me take that process and apply it to the racing scene.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And, a lot of athletes find that I've had athletes that have gone the adventure route, the FKT route, and then they go back into the racing, and they're kind of like, the racing's fun and all, but I kind of like that adventure that I designed. No offense to the race director, but I kind of liked what I put together. But yeah, I think it's a perspective shift as well, right? For sure. And I think the athletes that when they take the time, they design the FKT or the adventure. It's a little bit, I don't know if it's low key, but the the expectations are a little bit lower potentially. There's a little bit less stress going into it for at least some of the athletes personally that I've coached. So that can just kind of be refreshing for athletes too.
There's
Yeah.
not as much hype around it and
Yeah.
start line, finish
Hype.
line and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Totally
Exactly.
agree. I totally
Yeah.
agree. Okay,
But
so there's kind of one element of what I think is also going on, or maybe we're kind of at the tail end of it that we haven't touched on yet, because we're kind of presenting this rosy picture of, everything's awesome, and people are smashing these FKTs, and the racing season is coming back, and all that's great.
uh,
I think I think that is absolutely amazing. It's been a long time coming. But there are athletes that we've worked with where we have really tried hard to turn something around, where just the whole litany of circumstances, all of these races being canceled, athletes go from these really high highs, I'm going to do these awesome things, to these really low lows.
right.
And it's hard to pull athletes kind of like back out of that, kind of like back out of the pit. But now is the time. So what have you been doing with that kind of cohort of athletes, with those athletes that they need to kind of like turn around their prospects and their thought process on what the future holds for them?
Right. Yeah, no, that's that a lot of that is happening right now. I think it's that we're in a transition, another transition for sure. There's a lot of stress out there. Why am I doing this? Like,
Right.
not second guesses, but kind of in a way. So I think for me, it's just been kind of slowing the athletes down a little bit and kind of having them to kind of pause and just kind of take a look and really ask some questions that might not be easy to ask. But I think if the athletes ask these questions, why am I doing this? What does this bring to me? That brings about a clear understanding and can help with more of the next steps or the direction they want to go. Right. So instead of kind of getting wrapped up in like, I'm not enough, I haven't raced in a year, or, again, a lot of athletes are feeling isolated because they haven't raced, or a friend actually had the opportunity to go race, but theirs got canceled. So they're feeling a little isolated. So I think it's just having the athletes slow down, really kind of take some time to think about what it is that they really want to do and realize that that's a process
Right.
that doesn't happen overnight as well. And realizing that, yeah, we don't need to necessarily have an event on the calendar that you're building up to be enough and to be great. I think, an athlete can still, be empowered and better themselves in training. It doesn't have to be necessarily tied to an event. So I've seen that quite a bit. So it's giving athletes some space, slow down, some self-reflection, if you will. And I think that can go a long way.
I'm
Yeah.
totally with you on the slow down part, and I'm going to add
Yeah.
one piece, and that's zoom out.
Uh-huh.
Because we
Right. I
get
would
it.
agree with that.
The athletes that I see that are having for whatever reason, a really hard time right now getting back into things, they think that they have to be immediately better next week, or everything has to be solved. They have to know their race picture, their training
Right.
picture, and things like that next week. And when you get them to zoom out, sometimes that zoom out lens is 2 or 3 years, right? You're here now.
Yeah.
3 years ago, look what you were doing then. That provides the context that it's really not all that bad. Even for the athletes that we mentioned earlier that had a hard
Uh-huh.
time with COVID, their
Yeah.
training really suffered for whatever reason. They're a healthcare worker and just couldn't spend the time, or they just got in a rut or whatever. If you zoom that lens out, that performance decline is a very, very, very small bump in a extremely long road that might last, for some runners, decades, right? Even if it's just a few years, they're still way better off right now than they were, a couple of years ago. And that zoom out process provides, I think, the perfect perspective to say, you know what, I don't have to get it all back in a month or 2 months, and I'm way better off now than I was, 2 years ago or something like that. So if athletes just slow down and zoom out a little bit, that's going to go a long, long way.
100%. Athletes are in it for the long haul. I haven't yet coached an athlete that just wants to be good for a month or two.
Right.
It's, most athletes, they want to, be in it, and running for many, many years. So I think you're right on that, Coop. It's just kind of take a step back, slow down. You're not going to lose a ton of fitness, even if you decide to take a couple weeks, a month off, or, again, maybe you engage in a different sport to kind of freshen things up a little bit. But I think there's this, I see this kind of need to kind of constantly be trying to kind of do things or do the next big thing. And it's like, you don't have to do that. If you don't know what you want to do, slow down and it'll come. It'll come with time, with patience. So
Right. Not every
the
week has to
patience
be a
part is
great week.
hard because yeah, yeah, exactly. We don't have to be, we can't ride the wave nonstop every day, right? We're going to have to come off the wave a little bit. And that's a healthy thing to do. So.
Well, I still think that this is like one of the coolest, like coaching transition points that I've ever had in my career, because nobody's ever really gone through this where we've had kind of our competitive industry like shut down for a whole year, and now it's just getting booted back up online. It's not all at once, right? It's like one
Right.
of those slow, Commodore 64 boot ups or Apple IIe boot ups. Remember those old computers that took like 5 or 7
Right.
minutes to boot up and it seemed like it was forever? I think the race is getting booted back up or going through this similar process where it's just going to take, it's just going to take some time for everything to kind of come back online, and it's going to come back online in stages. Some are going to be different. Some are going to be in a different format. Some are going to have certain restrictions around them, but we're
Right.
starting to see, we're definitely starting to see indicators that, that these things are coming back. And like I said earlier, it's a really neat transition because there's some excitement in the air about it. So the athletes that kind of like
Yeah.
miss the boat can get back on it. They don't have to get back all on at once. And the athletes that have been training the whole time are finally like, yes, like everything is here. And there
Right.
are more options out there because of all these personal projects and FKTs. So it's just this cool confluence of all these really, of all these things that have been, percolating for a long time.
100%. Yeah. And like you said, that can be potentially overwhelming for some athletes as well. Just now the options of like creating
Right.
your own adventure, races now popping up. So again, I think my advice is you don't have to know exactly what you're going to do right away. I think just slow things down, ask yourself, what are some areas of my fitness that, I want to improve on, and maybe some kind of objectives, goals come about from that too. So yeah.
And I think for
Just
going back to that sentiment that you don't have to exactly know what's coming up, fundamentally, training doesn't change all that much. And I'll also say the outcome, like the improvement, because we're trying to improve athletes, right? That's one of our big goals here. Even if the order gets switched around a little bit, if you back your lens up and you zoom out to a year-long lens, the improvement that you squeak out still doesn't change like all that much, as long as you're process oriented, week to week, month to month, you're still working on things. You're still going to improve. And I've heard that from a lot of athletes that do have this ambiguity, or this
Mhm.
uncertainty, I guess is a better word, this uncertainty in the future. It's like, well, what should I be doing right now? Because I don't know 9 months from now exactly how this is all going to unfold. And I just tell them, listen, it's not going to change all that much. And even for whatever reason, if it did, doing things in a slightly different order fundamentally doesn't change the growth prospect that you're going to go through when you look at things over 9 months. Now, if something changes in the last 3 months, that's a different deal,
Right.
especially if it's dramatically, right? You go from 100 miles to 50K or something like that, 100 miles to a marathon. That would have an impact. But when we're looking at things that are 6 months, 9 months down the line, that might get changed a little bit, changing up the sequence of things really doesn't have that big of an impact at the end of the day. And I feel that provides a lot of relief for athletes just to get on with it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That space, that time, depending on where they're at. I mean, if they're just running easy, a lot of the time spent with running is not going to be hard. It's going to be generally more
Right.
comfortable running,
Right.
period. So I think I always tell athletes, if we're not doing intensity, that's okay. We can still
Yeah.
grow and develop by just getting out the door and still putting in good, solid work. So I agree with that as well. I think, yeah, it gets a little fuzzy when there's a quick change,
Right.
50K to now I'm going to do 100K, and it's in a shortish time frame.
A
But
quick change that's really dramatic, right? I
yeah,
think quick change that's, maybe it's 10% around the edges, whatever. Like, but a quick change
right.
that's really dramatic. Like one year they canceled UTMB. It went from 100 miles to 80K or 90K or something like that because of the weather. That had a big, I would say that's a market impact, but that
Right.
happens very, very, very rarely. And I don't think that uncertainty, right, at the end of the day is so big right now that you can't design very effective training that is going to pay off at the end of the day. Because you and I know as coaches, like we can go through case studies. They are
Mhm.
all remarkably similar to each other. We could line up 100 athletes that we all coach within our coaching group that have 100K, 100 milers or whatever in August and September. They're going to overlap like a tremendous amount. And that's not just because we're all in the same coaching group, but we're that's because the event demands are so very similar once you get into these longer distances that the event demands kind of take care of the training architecture by themselves.
Right. Yeah. Plus or minus some weeks, maybe a month, but
Yeah.
that's kind of pushing it. So it's very, very small time frame we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's not years. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Nor is it dramatic, nor would you
Yeah.
go from like 20 hours a week to 10 hours a week, right? You're
Yeah.
cutting your volume in half because of something. It
Yeah.
doesn't change fundamentally that
I
much.
mean, if an athlete changes, like if they're going from like a mountainous ultra to like a track event, that would shift a little bit. But the
But that's not
specificity,
happening.
no, that's not happening.
I mean, typically it's like one trail to the next, or like in canyons, they add a couple thousand feet, or
Right.
the
Right.
course gets cut off short, or there's an aid station or something like that. And I think the point that we're trying to make is that even even in these types of situations, you have to realize in your training right now, it doesn't fundamentally change a whole lot. So if you stay the course, you're still going to improve. And even in the absolute worst case situation, the rug totally gets pulled out from underneath you and the race doesn't happen, you're still fitter than you were before, and that is not a bad thing.
Not a bad thing at all. No. And not a bad thing for just the year, again, zooming out and the following year.
Next
I have
year.
athletes that, yeah, I mean, to be honest, I have had some athletes that, they've kind of said, you know what, there's nothing that I'm really that excited about that I want to really train for in 2021. And we're looking into 2022. Right. And
Yeah.
so they have that much more time because they are seeing the benefit and the reward of consistent work without the interruption, you know, and so they're like, let's run with that. What can we do with another year of this type of work? So,
Mm. That's
yeah,
interesting because I actually hadn't put a whole lot of thought into this before. Because of the lack of racing and the work is uninterrupted, you have more guideposts to go from, that the training is effective. Sometimes the racing actually interferes with all those guideposts because
sometimes, yeah,
we don't have the luxury of like throwing people in a physiology lab every 3 months and like very precisely determining, are they better or are they not. A lot of
right,
times we're using the training, normalized graded pace, and how they feel on the training, and maybe they're doing time trials or they're doing intervals around a certain loop or whatever, where
yeah,
they know week to week, month to month, kind of where they're standing. That picture is hard to paint, and it's harder to paint when you have races kind of interrupting it. But because of this continuous nature of training, and that there are more of these guideposts, you actually can see the improvement in training. And then it's almost, you don't have to race, right? Because a lot of people use races to prove that their
to
training
prove,
is working
yeah, right,
when you should have the training itself.
yeah, oh, exactly, yeah, that's been fun to see. Um,
Awesome, man. All right, so any final words of wisdom for the athletes that are coming back into racing right now that we can leave people with?
yeah, I think as athletes start to get back into if the races pop back on the calendar, or if it's gotten kind of pushed to the fall, which has been a common theme, right? After
Right,
races
right.
getting kind of, I don't know if I want to say kick down the road, but
Yeah, yeah.
is, again, I go back to it's going to happen, and it's happening to not just you, but it's, the cancellations, the postponements it's very much so still 2021, and that's okay. It's not just you. There's other athletes that are having races that are getting kind of thrown around. There's other athletes that don't know what they're going to do, and I think that can be a hard spot to be in, because it's like, I'm used to racing 3 times a year and I haven't raced at all. And am I enough? Like, oh my God, I got to prove myself. And I think the proof can be in, just like, again, what I've said is about going out and discovering and getting creative with the approach to the process of training. And not just necessarily feeling like it needs to be attached to an event a month, 2 months away. It can be right here, right now. What can I do with my training today? And I think that can be a very powerful way for athletes to go into another transition. So
that's awesome. You got a lot of tools right here, right now, that are free and easily accessible, all at your disposal. Very wise sportsman. Thanks, man. Thanks for coming on the podcast today. Your athletes are better off having you as a coach, John. I've always had a ton of respect for you.
Appreciate it, Koop. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Absolutely. Oh, by the way, what's on your calendar?
What's on my calendar? I think last year I might have brought it up with the group, but did the Bob Marshall Wilderness Open with actually another friend of mine. Chantel's coaching Brandon, who I think was on the podcast at some point.
On the podcast. Yep.
Yeah. So we're going to head back out into the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and that's a traverse. It's about 120 miles. A lot of it's off trail, navigating through Grizz country, lots of wildlife out there. So that's kind of a fun adventure that's coming up in about 4 weeks. I'm going to give a go actually on the long trail, which I've been wanting to do for quite some time. So that's will be kind of a big project for me. And that's going to be in July. So I'm going to do that unsupported, starting on the northern terminus and heading south down to Massachusetts. So that's going to be big.
The long trail, for the listeners out there that don't realize what it is, it goes the length of Vermont from north to south or south to north. John's going to go north to south. I've had an athlete that's gone out there for the last few years and done it. It is really hard. It is a really, especially the northern part, is a hard, very technical trail. It gets a little easier once you link up with the Appalachian Trail. Mm-hmm. But it's a sweet trail.
Yeah. So I'm really excited about that. Something I've been wanting to do for many years, and then I'll do the rut at the end of the year. But nice. I'm excited also to announce that I won't be doing the Bear 100 this year, which I'm actually really thrilled about that.
How many times have you done the Bear? This is why this is funny.
Not 9 times. So nine starts. I say 9 starts. Okay. I finished it 7 times. So this would have been my 10th year, but yeah, I'm just excited to shake it up. And I have a lot of athletes that go out because they know that I've raced it so many years. So I have, I think, 6 athletes that are signed up for this year again.
Wow.
So I'm excited to be on the other side and get back and crew and just help out at the race this year. So
that's awesome, John. You're going to have a good one, man. You're going to have fun on a long trail.
Yeah. Awesome.
Right,
we'll see you, Koop.
Yeah, man.
Bye.
All right, trail and ultra runners, there you go. There you have it. That was really fun. Thank you to John for coming on the podcast today. Like I said, John is one of the coaches that I have the most amount of respect for. I get to see his athletes at all these races, a lot of them that we mentioned on the podcast, and they have the best things to say about John, and you can see why on this particular podcast. Appreciate the heck out of everybody listening today, and as always, we will see you out on the trails.